Hello, my name is Noah Wistman, and here's a video I'm making. Uh, this is the first video I'm making as a graduate student for my YouTube channel. Um, I'm making this video because I'm hoping to start to document my work as a graduate student, my research, my teaching, my learning, just the ideas that I'm having as a way of putting them together for myself, and then hopefully, sometime maybe for other people as well as I get better at doing this. Just for context, I'm an educational psychology student in the PhD program at the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm in my first year right now, second semester, and I've always had a sort of interest in philosophy, the philosophy of science, the scientific method, sciences outside of psychology, where I find myself now. Um, it, and I've always been someone who is interested in framing the thinking that I'm doing within a larger context. Not just, doing things, going through the motions, but really understanding the things that I'm doing in a systematic way or a systemic way. Either way, I think applies. Um, and so, what I've been thinking about over the past couple of months at this point, really, is this idea here, this idea of total learning. Um, and this is a framework that I've been considering, which I'm going to adopt, I have adopted as the sort of guiding framework of the way that I'm approaching research as an educational psychologist, and also teaching to an extent through the lens of educational psychology. And this video here is going to be going over my thoughts about this, again, for myself and then for anybody who's interested. Um, so what I have here to start off with is an outline, what is total learning? What is the total learning construct? Um, that's what we'll be going over here. So I'm going to start off. Again, this is just the outline right here. We'll get into all of these concepts more as we go down the document. But I'm going to start with an introduction, just going over the definition of total learning as I've conceived of it, the claims that it makes. In brief, and again, all of these things will be expanded on, but total learning can be thought of as all learning done by a subject in a given period of time. What is all learning? What is a subject? What periods of time would be qualifying? We'll elaborate on that later. And the idea of total learning, again, the way that I've conceived it, is for the idea to be expansive and inclusive. That we are going to take anything that you might consider to be learning, that you might consider to count to this total amount of learning. Anything that could possibly qualify, we're going to take it. It's a very expansive definition of learning. We'll talk about how expansive it is later. And at the same time, while it is very kind of heady and expansive and theoretical, it's also meant to be a kind of pragmatic expansion of the definition of learning. It's meant to have a kind of concreteness to it, claims that are concrete, which we'll talk about as well. Then we'll get into the implications of these claims and definitions. What does adopting a broad perspective on what qualifies as learning and the total amount of learning people are doing, what implications does it have for our understanding of learning and learning research? Well, one of the implications that it has is that learning is typically underestimated. When we expand the range of concepts that we would understand to be learning and we expand our understanding of the total amount of learning that people are doing in a given period of time, we see that people's learning is generally underestimated, that they're learning more than we think that they are. Um, Another implication, related implication, is that people tend to learn similar amounts in a given period of time. They may be learning different things, but the total learning that they're doing tends to be fairly similar. We'll talk about that. And while it is the case that people um, may be doing more learning than we think, and that they may be learning more similar amounts of things than we tend to think, that does not necessarily mean that the learning that they're doing is all of equal usefulness. You could do learning that is more useful, that is not useful, that may in fact be counterproductive. Um, and indeed, people may be learning things that are not accurate. Again, this is something we'll talk about as well when we talk about the definition of total learning. But you can learn something that is wrong. And so we can also think about the learning that people are doing as being correct, fictional, and incorrect, or being a misconception, as it's been called in the literature. Okay, and then we will talk about, once we talk about the basic definition, the implications, I'll be talking as well about the uses of total learning. What is the point of adopting this framework and this perspective on learning? We can use this perspective, we can take this perspective and generate hypotheses, unique hypotheses that may have been underexplored in the past. We can appreciate people's hidden or unknown abilities. Again, when we expand what we understand to be learning, we can appreciate that people are doing learning that we didn't think they were doing. We can use this to broaden theoretical understandings and indeed maybe find relationships between apparently disparate theories by broadening our horizons. We can explain study limitations and apparently discrepant results. And we can also maybe potentially improve our practice as researchers by dissolving artificial boundaries. When we put all learning under one umbrella, we can understand it and the connections that occur between different domains within learning, maybe more holistically, potentially. Again, we'll talk about this more later. And I should follow up by saying that I consider the things that I'm about to talk about here to be an introduction to the idea of total learning. This is just what I've come up with in a couple of months of thinking and reading. There are more ideas that I won't get to in this video, which I'll try to cover in a follow-up video, some more specific implications and further elaborations. And these will kind of be the area that those will be operating in for the most part. So we're just going to do the introduction now, which should be plenty of time spent on that, and we'll go from there. Okay, so let's get into definitions and claims. Okay, starting right off. I think, to me, everything I've been saying makes sense, but throughout this whole introduction section makes a lot of sense because I've been thinking about these things. But when I've described it to other people, it's been helpful to give a lot of examples. So I'll be sprinkling those in as I go through these definitions and claims. So, okay, let's start with the core definitional claim mentioned before of total learning. And we'll also talk about, as we give that core definition, the philosophical influences that have informed the construction of total learning as a concept as a named concept in my head. Again, to restate that basic definition, total learning or the total learning construct is all learning done by a subject, and this could be a person, animal, computer, community, etc., in a given period of time. This could be hour, a day, a decade, a lifetime, a cultural history. So we can give a couple of examples of this. So, for example, let's say that we wanted to understand what the total learning of a person was over the course of an hour. This is one of the boundaries that we could place on our measurement of total learning. Well, how might we go about measuring this? Well, we would go to a person, we would find some person, and say, hey, what were the things that you learned about over the past hour? And we would try to get, in order to measure the total learning construct, a representation of everything that that person learned over the course of the past hour. And if you think about it for a second, you'll realize that the person will have quite a bit that they learned over the past hour. They'll have learned where a new store is on their block. They may have learned, they watched a YouTube video and learned a little bit about a period of history they didn't know about. They may have learned a new phone number. They may have learned something new about their friends that they were texting, that so-and-so got married to so-and-so or broke up with so-and-so. They may have learned all of these different kinds of, we would say, like descriptive information. And They could have learned any number of new skills. They could have learned, um, what path they need to walk in order to get to the new store that opened up on their block. They may have learned that there's now construction going on their street and they need to walk around it. All these kind of navigational learning. They could have learned about how to use a new app that they're playing on their phone. Let me pause for a second here. As you can see that there's a lot that people are learning. You know, when we tend to study learning, we think about people learning like science, we think about them learning math, we think about them learning academic subjects, and we'll talk about this as we go along. But if we try just to think about all the things that people are learning, not just the academic things, we see that they're learning quite a bit over the course of an hour and a day. And then, in fact, it'd be very difficult to capture all of the things that they're learning. Again, it's hard enough to capture all of the descriptive things that they're learning, all of the descriptive knowledge they're obtaining, but what about that procedural knowledge, the narrative knowledge, the knowledge of personal experience? People, you could say that someone has learned that they're getting hungry and that they need to eat something over the course of half an hour. They realized it. And that's to say nothing of a day, a decade, a week, a month, and indeed a lifetime. How could you possibly capture all of the learning that a person did over the course of their lifetime? Again, right at the first hurdle, we can see that this is not something that is really practically measurable. You'd never be able to really get everything a person learned over any period of time, any meaningful period of time, um, and completely represent it. Okay. And of course, just as you could do this for a person, you could do this for an animal. What's everything that this animal has learned over the course of the hour, day, decade, lifetime? Perhaps a computer. And you could even think about how much has this group learned over the course of an hour, day, decade, lifetime of the cultural group, however you define that. Okay, so again, expanding that definition of learning and saying, what if we tried to measure all of the learning that was done by a subject in a given period of time? And we find very quickly that that would be a very quote unquote large amount, in fact, an immeasurably large amount. And there would be many kinds of learning that people would do that would be very difficult for us to directly measure. And we'll talk about exactly how expansive that definition is as we go. But just on the first glance, we can see it's going to be quite a lot of different things included in the total learning construct. Okay, so the total learning construct we've kind of established, it's not something you can directly measure. Indeed, it doesn't create a falsifiable hypothesis in any kind of meaningful way. It is I would describe it as a kind of structuralist concept. It has structuralist origins as an idea. Um, Famously, the structuralist thinkers that I'm the most familiar with as someone who's an educational psychologist are Jean Levi-Strauss, sorry, not Jean Levi-Strauss, Jean Piaget and Levi-Strauss. Um, these are the structuralist thinkers that I'm most familiar with, and indeed it was their ideas that helped me to think about this concept. Um, Famously, Levi-Strauss's kinship relations are like a classic example of a structuralist concept. Levi-Strauss sort of took a step back from the practical, physical, measurable world and said, well, let's just imagine all the possible combinations of relations between people. Kind of algebraically, person A has this relationship with person B, and this relationship with person C, and this relationship with person D, and person C and D have this relationship, and you just map out all the possible kinds of kinship relationships that a person could have. And then once you have this kind of abstracted, totalizing construct, you go to the physical world, the real world, the empirical, measurable world, and you see how does it fit into that construct, which has definitionally encapsulated all possible options. We've described a framework in which we can fit all possible options. well, how do the real world options actually slot into that framework? This is a sort of classical example of a structuralist construct or a structuralist concept. It has this kind of mathematical quality to it, definitional quality to it. We first set a frame that must encapsulate all possible, logically encapsulate all possible options, and then we go into the physical world, into the empirical reality, and see how that matches up with the framework that we've established. Piaget's operational stages have this similar kind of quality. He was a little bit more empirical in their formation, but once defined, they attempt to encapsulate all of the possible idiosyncratic behaviors that children can display at a certain stage of development. We observe those behaviors and then we say which stage they fit into. And so total learning has the same quality where there must theoretically be a total amount of learning, however we define it. There will be a total amount of whatever this thing called learning is that occurs within a given subject within a given period of time. And total learning simply draws that the hypothetical, theoretical, imaginary, constructual boundary and says, now that we've set the bounds widely, let's go look at the actual person over that actual given period of time and see how much we can fill this bubble up with real empirical observations of learning, demonstrable learning. That's sort of the type of idea that total learning is. It's a framework in which we can then fit our observations of the world. It must exist in some theoretical sense, even if it can never be measured, because however you define learning, however you define total, there will be a total amount of it that occurs within a subject in a given period of time, and then you can go and try to find that and more closely approximate it, even if you can never completely approximate it. Okay. Again, I've been talking about this next point already here. It can probably never be directly measured or meaningfully approximated, but it must logically exist. And if we were omniscient, if we could perfectly know the mind of another person, or if we could perfectly know the mind of an animal, or the collective minds of a community, we could then see the bounds of the total learning that that community participated in. You can imagine, what if our our electronic sensory equipment became fine-grained enough that we could see every change in every neuron that is firing in the mind, in the brain, simultaneously, in every dendritic formation, all at once. Maybe then we could say this is our measurement of total learning. Of course, even that could be challenged. But maybe then we could say this is our measurement of total learning. And that is the bound, that is us filling up the bounds as we have drawn them. Not very particularly close to being able to do this at the moment. And indeed, it may not ever truly be possible to completely measure total learning, but maybe we can, and in fact, furthermore, it probably can't even be meaningfully approximated. So much of it is occurring and it's so difficult to measure or show evidence of that even a close approximation may be outside of our reach, but we can more closely approximate, or we may be able to more closely approximate it by asking broader questions and finding more varied answers. But okay, again, this is all about it being this kind of structuralist concept. With that said, again, structuralism, that structuralist feeling of a definitional bound, which we then fill in with empirical observations. I've also been influenced by deconstructuralist points a la Derrida, who was directly commenting on a lot of Levi-Strauss's work back in the day. Um, the total learning construct, the total learning framework, as I've conceived it, accepts deconstructionist points, where in order to analyze total learning, or something that we're going to try to place within the framework of total learning, we have to pick an arbitrary center, and in doing so miss out on the sense of dynamic change. Once we set the bounds of this person in this period of time, we've now flattened the learning that they've done, we've summated it, rather than seeing it as something that changed from second to second, from moment to moment, and developed. We've lost the temporal quality by creating this framework of total learning. And indeed, in the follow-up video, uh, which I'm planning to make for this, I'll talk more about how you can think of that temporal aspect. But certainly, um, we accept that point that we are choosing a kind of this hour, this person, this perspective, and we are saying this is the total amount of learning that occurred in that period of time, and in doing so, we're summating that and missing out on the dynamic aspect of it. To understand that aspect, we'd have to do some kind of different type. We have to adopt some different construct or some related but more nuanced construct or different valenced construct, which again I'll talk about more in a follow-up because I've been thinking more about this point. Again, history of philosophy here, influence on the thought. Total learning as a construct can also be thought of as a hermeneutic in the sense of Gadamer and that whole school of thought. It invites a theory of interpretation. It's if two learning scientists, educational psychologists, cognitive psychologists look at the same instance of learning, one can take a certain theoretical approach, a Piagetian approach to interpreting that sense of learning, a Vygotskian approach to interpreting that instance of learning, a a cognitive, maybe cognitive load theory approach to understanding that instance of learning. Well, you can also take a total learning perspective on that instance of learning and say, how does that instance of learning fit into my framework of interpretation? The understanding that I've placed, the framework, the understanding that and framework that I've placed onto the world, that is also a way of thinking about the total learning construct. It's as an interpretive framework where we look at an instance and say, how does it fit into this? Again, sort of also covered in the idea of it being a structuralist concept. Um, I bring up the point of it being hermeneutic, and inviting a theory of interpretation to point out that it is not necessarily a better mode of interpretation or a final and true mode of interpretation compared to other theoretical constructs that exist, but that it is an alternative, and maybe an alternative that has its own advantages, which we'll discuss later. Okay, so with that background stated, hopefully in a somewhat comprehensible way, now we can get into, I think, the key question of the total learning construct and the driving question which has led me to this concept, which is what qualifies as learning. If we're going to try to create this theoretical bound which encapsulates all of the learning done by a subject in a given period of time, we really need to make sure we define what we believe learning to be, so we know what to include within that bound and what to exclude. Okay, so I'll go into quickly here again for context, and again the context that's leading up to this thought process for myself. A little bit of the history of psychology, history of learning science, study of learning, at least as far as the field of psychology is concerned. And I would argue that historically in psychology, the study of learning started with a very narrow scope and then adopted increasingly wide scopes. And this is an oversimplification for sure. Notably, I'm not covering the Gestalt theorists here, although they have their own thoughts about this. But I do think that you can trace this like overall trend. And the reason why the study of learning started with like a narrow scope in terms of what it was willing to consider to be learning, and that scope broadened, was methodological and is methodological, where people have asked for a very long time, what can I prove is learning? And at the beginning of the study of learning in the psychological sciences, people felt that, they believed that they could only prove a very narrow set of things and behaviors were evidence of learning. They could only accept a narrow set of behaviors as evidence of learning. And the evidence that could be accepted as evidence of learning, again, answering the question, what can I prove as learning, has been steadily expanded in different directions by different researchers. So let me try to illustrate this point. One of the earliest people to study learning and memory was Ebbinghaus, who did so in the 1800s. And he started off doing tests on himself, so a single subject, trying to memorize strings of random syllables and numbers. These things that were completely stripped of any kind of extra meaning or layered over meaning, just like a random series of stimuli, random series of numbers, random series of syllables. I'm sorry, I said words. It wasn't even words. It was random syllables, trying to strip quote unquote confounding factors away and measure learning quote unquote purely. And of course, he created these famous forgetting curves, which are still relevant today. But you can see how this is a study of learning. It was an important study of learning, but it took a very narrow perspective on what could be studied as learning. This is one person, random numbers and syllables, in a room alone, testing himself on a piece of paper. It's a very narrow type of study, and it was expanded, although you could argue it was more expanded laterally rather than totally, by the behavioralists, the famous behavioralist movement, Skinner, Watson, Thorndike, you know the names, you know. And Skinner, Watson, Thorndike would only accept visible changes in behavior as evidence of learning. You had to show that you have a stimulus and a response to that stimulus, and then you can show a response to a new stimulus that's been paired with that stimulus. There's a very limited sense of what we will accept as evidence of learning. It has to be an express reaction to same stimulus. And indeed, Skinner was particularly extreme and also very influential in the precision of what he required to be as evidence of learning. Um, and famously, Skinner, I don't know about famously, but I think it's really cool, interesting. Skinner did not like statistics. He didn't like the idea that you could show learning across individuals on average. He wanted to see each individual subject, in this case, he would do studies on animals, generally speaking, show the same process of learning, the same curve. And he would construct experiments in order to generate such a curve. And of course, the common criticism, and it's a very valid criticism of Skinner's approach and the behavioralist approach, is that they, in order to get the kind of evidence that they wanted to see, they had to create artificial situations which didn't demonstrate learning in its totality, but rather just one isolated strand of what learning is and what it constitutes. And um, it was a big sort of landmark moment um, when Tolman published his latent learning experiment, where he showed evidence that rats would learn the layouts of mazes, but that you wouldn't necessarily see evidence of it right away. And importantly, they seemed to be learning this without any direct incentive, stimulus, no direct reward, which was motivating them to do so. They seemed to be learning just as they walked around without any real prime directive with which to do so. I can recount that experiment here, but I'll skim over it for now. You can go read it. It's very kind of famous, at least within the field. But this was a big moment in the history of the study of learning sciences, and indeed of cognition in general, because it showed that things could be happening within the mind, learning could be occurring inside of the organism without it being immediately externally visible. It gave credence to the idea that learning can occur without being externalized, that it can all be happening up in here in the head. And This is one of the many factors that leads to the so-called cognitive revolution. Um, and the cognitive revolution doesn't just encapsulate learning, and learning is the study of learning, but also of general of processing of stimuli, not just as it affects memory or changes in behavior, which would be the definition of learning in this context, but also just that whole process of that internal psychic world and trying to understand it in a systematic way. Um, and spinning out of the cognitive revolution, we see concepts of metacognitive learning, thinking about thinking, learning about learning, situated learning, the idea that you can learn something in a specific context which does not apply to other contexts. And conversely, you can learn something that does apply to multiple contexts. That's another way of thinking about learning. Um, More recently, and again, this is even a new thing, a new movement that which is distinct from the cognitive revolution. You see the emergence of the idea of social and emotional learning, learning about your own feelings and the feelings of others. This idea that you can have a concept of your feelings, not just an experience of them, at which both of which inform the other. All of this is to say that you can see there's been an expansion of bounds. Um, Again, I won't get into too much detail about the evidence that people accept as proof that these types of learning occur, which is a whole another subject which I may do a video on. However, um, you can see through this like brief history that people have asked, what can I prove is learning over the years, and have found wider and wider answers and considered more and more types of thinking and experience and behavior as legitimate learning, a legitimate form of learning, as evidence of learning, so to speak. Okay, that's the 101 history right there. So bringing it back, this has been like the history leading up to the moment which we find ourselves now. You can see there's been this historical expansion of the definition of learning. Well, total learning looks at this history and says, look, we're considering more and more different kinds of things to be learning. We're broadening our definition of learning, and we're broadening the evidence that we'll accept as legitimate proof of learning, signs of learning. Well, we're going to take as broad a stance as possible. And in a sense, this is to preempt the expansion that is to come. If the history of learning science, of the psychology of learning, has been one of expansion, well, let's expand all the way out. Get out ahead of the expansion that is to come. And then um, we can start to ask new questions that would have come 20 years from now, but we're going to do it ahead of time, you know? Okay, that's sort of motive. Um, how are we going to get to this broadest possible stance? Well, we're going to ask a different question. Rather than asking what can I prove is learning, which I believe is the question that learning scientists have primarily asked up to this point, we're going to ask the question, what can I prove is not learning? And if we cannot prove that something is not learning, we cannot come up with a legitimate argument for why it is not learning, we're going to accept it as a legitimate form of learning. Again, in order to draw that broadest possible circle. This process of asking what can I prove is not learning, and if I can't prove it's not learning, I'll accept it as a form of learning, has a similar kind of feeling to Rene Descartes' radical doubt, where he asked, what can I prove that is real? What can I prove that I know? Um, and if he could find any kind of argument for why it could be that his belief was not true, he would discard it. It has that kind of feeling to it of this cyclical question. Um, but rather than taking a radical doubt, where we doubt all information we cannot provide a proof for in support of, It's a kind of radical belief where we accept all things which we cannot provide an argument against, rather than being in and going out, rather than saying this is what we believe to be learning and let's see if we can accept something that we don't currently believe to be learning into our framework. We're going to go out and then come back in. We're going to say we're going to accept anything even vaguely reasonable as learning, and then we'll come in to the real practical questions of observation and experimentation and see where it could possibly fit within that very broad framework. Okay. So, taking this approach of let's go out and come back in, let's ask what can I prove is not learning, let's start asking that question and start bringing up some of the possible objections that a person could bring up for saying, hey, that's not learning, and say, well, can I refute that objection and therefore accept this as a form of learning? Again, anything that is a vaguely reasonable argument that this could be learning, we're going to take it. Okay. Let's say it right off the bat. Certainly, learning can be any form of long-term memory change. Semantic memory change, episodic memory change, procedural, the formation of a schema, the adoption of muscle memory, greater myelination of neurocells, the formation of new dendrites, dendritic formation. Whatever we take as a change in long-term memory will all easily qualify in our system, in our framework of total learning, the broadest possible stance. If anybody has accepted this as a form of learning already, we're obviously going to accept it. We're taking all comers. Note that some researchers may already be objecting and saying that should not be accepted as a form of learning. But we're going to. We're going to. And this right here, a change in long-term memory, is, I would say, the generally adopted stance of what qualifies as learning by a lot of cognitive psychologists who are interested in the question of what learning is. It is already further than a lot of educational psychologists will go, and we'll talk about that as we go. And indeed, what I'll do now is go through a lot of the objections that an educational psychologist might make to this kind of broad definition of learning, any change in long-term memory. First of all, does the information that is being learned have to be correct? And I would say this is a very common educational psychology, cognitive psychology division, where if an educational psychology gives you a test on biology, because you just took a biology class and we want to see how much you learned from that biology class, and you put an answer in for all 100 questions and you get 70 of them right and 30 of them wrong, an educational psychologist might say, look, you learned 70% of the information. You got 70% of it right, 30% of your answers were wrong, which means you either didn't learn it or you learned something that was incorrect. You thought you knew the answer, but the answer was wrong. And therefore, we say that your learning was 70% of the information that you were tested on. Of course, you have to factor in the chance of getting something correct randomly. With that said, that would be a popular conception of learning in educational psychology, that correctness is an important part of the measurement of learning. However, what we could say to that kind of raised hand objection is that, listen, you can learn things that are fictional. You can learn about Huckleberry Finn, and you can learn about Jay Gatsby, and you can learn about all of these things that do not really exist in reality. They don't map to any kind of empirical existence other than so much as they exist in some form of literature, some kind of fictional world. And that's clearly a form of learning, and we would accept that, generally speaking, as a form of learning. And furthermore, once you are okay with the idea that you can learn something that's fictional, you can also learn something that is just simply wrong. You can learn someone's phone number and later discover that you have actually learned someone else's phone number, not the person that you were thinking. You've learned fictional information in that sense, false information in that sense. But clearly, there's still a change in your long term memory. And because we are going to accept a very broad definition of learning, we're certainly not going to reject some learning that you've done just because it's incorrect learning, just because you've learned something that does not map to empirical reality. This has there's an when we get to the implication sections. I mentioned this briefly. This idea of useful learning, an implication for later. When we talk about, you got 70% of the questions right and 30% of the questions wrong, we're starting to get towards, and that's what we consider to be learning. We're getting to this idea of useful learning, which is what many people currently, of my concept of useful learning, which I've created to fit within the total learning framework, which is what many people currently would think of as learning, especially educational psychologists. When they talk about you learn that and you fail to learn that, they mean you have generated useful learning versus you've generated some kind of learning which is not useful. But we'll get to that when we get to the implications section. Okay. Now this is an interesting point as well, and this is where maybe even some cognitive psychologists would shirk a little bit at this, which is the point of, does learning have to be associated with a change in behavior? Again, we often would define learning as a change in long-term memory, but what about a reinforcement, a sort of keeping sharp? We all understand that if I learn how to uh, drive a car, let's say, that if I then don't drive a car for 3 years, it's not like that learning that I've done has crystallized and I'll be able to drive a car just as well as I could 3 years ago when I sit in that car again. There's a very real sense in which I'm going to have to relearn those things that I learned before. And this process may be very quick, certainly much quicker than it was the first time, but I've definitely lost some of that edge that I would have had if I kept driving every day. There's a sense in which learning can be a restatement of something that you have, quote unquote, already learned, keeping it sharp, um, keeping it refined. There's a natural degradation of a skill, of access to a fact or a piece of knowledge, that the recapitulation of prevents the degradation of. And we would, in a broad definition of learning, accept this as well. This is not so much a change in long-term memory as the prevention of the degradation of the natural degradation of long-term memory. And this could also be considered to be a form of learning. Okay, and what about, of course, a predisposition? Again, this is also learning that can occur without being associated with a change in behavior, a priming, a framing, a latent conceptual change. Again, going to those rat studies where they learn the maze without an incentive to. All of these kinds of learning, the first mentioned, and these predisposition, the latent conceptual change, may never be acted upon. They're not necessarily going to be associated with a change in behavior, but that's a failure to measure. That's a failure to have an opportunity to display, not, we would say, a failure to learn, not necessarily no interaction with long-term memory. Do these stimuli have? Okay. So certainly we're going to accept that total learning things that are included within the circle of total learning may not be associated with changes in behavior and maybe never be demonstrated, but they're certainly still occurring in there. Okay, now this is an interesting point here. Is forgetting a form of learning? Oftentimes learning is thought of as being additive. We're putting new information in there, and this is what we consider to be learning. We're building our understanding, our knowledge, our our remembered history of our experiences. However, isn't the efficient decrease in unused skills or unused information and knowledge an organized response to the environment? Unlearning, as you might say, clearly fits a broad learning definition. When we learn, so to speak, that incorrect phone number, we have to go back to our friend and ask them for the real phone number, which we wrote down incorrectly, we misheard, we forgot. And not only do we have to learn that new phone number, we have to unlearn what we thought was the real phone number. We have to forget it, we have to bury it. And there's a good amount of debate about what forgetting actually is and whether or not we truly forget anything or if it gets kind of overwritten in a sense. But regardless of what the actual mechanism of forgetting is, we can say that it is certainly an important part of what we would think of as being learning, as the overall learning that's being done. The adoption of a new piece of information or a new skill, and then the reduction in prevalence or presence of that information skill is in and of itself a part of the learning process and should be thought of as within the bounds of total learning if we're counting everything that we could possibly count. Overcoming trauma, misconceptions. Again, what it is or is not forgetting is a little bit controversial, but whatever that process is, we should be thinking about that process and including that process in our consideration of the total learning done by a person or subject in a given period of time. I think this is easiest to think about in terms of computer learning because with computers we can really see what we're putting in and taking out of a system. But if a computer has bugs in its code and we delete those bugs, we've just removed something from that system and that has caused it to operate more efficiently. And we would certainly want to, in our description of the process of arriving at this form of behavior that the computer has taken, want to include the fact that we took these things out. That would be part of that computer's learning process, so to speak. And we can think about a similar principle applying to biological learning, learning in human beings. Forgetting should be thought of as a form of learning as well. Maybe a different form of learning, but a form of learning. Do I need, next question, external stimuli to facilitate learning? This is another interesting question. Again, some cognitive psychologists and educational psychologists might take the stance that learning is about the interaction of the internal world with the external world. But what about the interaction of the internal world with the internal world? Can we learn completely within that closed system? Can it be a reformation of internal structures, such as is associated with sleep and daydreaming, without any direct external contact? I would say yes. The reconstruction of things within the mind can also be thought of as a form of learning and certainly could constitute a change in long-term memory. We might look at a person who is, for example, napping through their algebra class and say, look, you're not learning anything. But that's probably not true. They actually probably are learning something in this given period of time. It's just maybe not about algebra. But there's some reformation and reconstruction going on inside of their head. They're still participating in a learning activity. This line of research, again, fascinating. I could get into it, but we do know that people make connections between ideas in their heads while they're sleeping, and unique connections which they may not make while they're awake. You can make a kind of philosophical argument, which is within the realm of science as well, of the observable sciences as well, but certainly leans towards philosophy, that in some sense external stimuli may be necessary in order to facilitate learning in some ultimate sense, that you have to have some interaction with the external world in order to be able to do something that we would call learning. What can a brain in a jar really learn? Can you really learn with just an internal conversation? But certainly, in a pragmatic sense, you can learn a lot with an internal conversation with the latent experiences that you've taken in. You don't need a new experience in order to learn something new. It can happen within the back catalog that you've already acquired. An internal conversation. Okay. Up until now, I think we've been within all the objections that I've been raising and the counter arguments to those and saying we are going to include this, we are going to include this, we are going to include this as within the total learning construct have been within the wider cognitive frameworks that have been established and that have been adopted by many researchers in that line of work. I think we are outside of the bounds of what a lot of educational psychologists would consider to be learning. A lot of people would already be raising objections, but within the kind of established wider cognitive frameworks, we're still having a similar conception of learning to those perspectives. And what we're going to do now is perhaps go one bridge further and take an even broader conception of learning than the wider cognitive conceptions of learning within the human sense. This is um, this is an interesting point. Many cognitive psychologists and psychologists more broadly will define learning as a change in long-term memory, but does it really have to be a change in long-term memory? Can it simply be a change in sensory and short-term memory, working memory? Can't I say that I learned and then I forgot very quickly? Isn't it the case that those stimuli entered into my brain through whichever sensory organ they came in, and a process was imposed upon them? We don't fully understand this process, but a process was imposed upon them, and then some of it translated into my long-term memory, affected things in my long-term memory, but some of it quote unquote dissipated, quote unquote, and was quote unquote forgotten. Can't I say I learned then I forgot quickly? And I think the answer is yes. That if we want to consider the total learning that was done by a person in a subject in a given period of time, in this case a human being, in the psychological sense, it would be more accurate to say that this person learned something and then forgot these aspects of it than it would be to say that they didn't learn. Total learning, the total learning perspective says that you learned then you forgot, which is also a form of learning, rather than you didn't learn those things. Therefore, changes in working and sensory memory are also learning. They're just learning that is somehow has this transitory property to it. This gets into the difference between learning and memory. Process and status, space and time. See that conversation about structuralism and deconstructuralism, which is coming in the following video. Okay. Practically speaking, this is all kind of like theoretical. And okay, is it really different to say I learned it, then I forgot it, and I didn't learn it? What's the pragmatic difference? Well, pragmatically, maybe some traces get in and stick around. Maybe some of the things that appear to be disappearing in the transition from sensory working to long-term memory, as it's commonly conceived of, maybe they are not disappearing completely. And we can see these in priming effect studies and framing effect studies where maybe these things that appear to be dissipating and not having an impact on long-term memory are having more of an impact than they initially appear to be having, even if it's a very subtle impact. They're just hard to measure. And total learning certainly does not want to lose these potential subtleties. It wants to include them within its totalizing framework. So we're going to say, in the total learning perspective, that you learn and you quickly forgot. And maybe you didn't completely forget. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a change in long-term memory. Does it have to be in the brain, as far as people are concerned? Does your immune system learn? your immune system, you get infected with a new virus, it develops it captures the virus, breaks it down, develops antibodies, uses those antibodies the next time it encounters the same virus. That, you can argue, is a form of learning. It sure looks a lot like all of the kinds of learning that do happen in the brain, where there's a new stimulus, there's an analysis of that stimulus, and now there's a new behavior in response to that stimulus, one that did not exist before. It sure looks like learning. Do plants learn? There's a lot of interesting studies where if insects start to eat the leaves of plants in one area, they'll release chemical signals which tells other plants in the area to start to make certain changes in their chemical balances, and if this process repeats, they'll grow in different ways. Maybe plants learn as well. We don't necessarily have to talk about neurological changes. Is natural selection a form of learning? Do genes learn? You want to talk about genes being a form of memory and leading to the creation of different proteins, which is a different form of behavior, and the pressures of the environment leading to changes in expressed biologically driven behaviors over time. Can we talk about a species as our subject and an epoch as our time frame? Do genes learn? You know, we're getting a little bit out in left field, but that's the direction we were going in anyway. And I would argue that in the total learning framework, we would really like to include all of these things. We would like to say that the immune system learns, and that plants learn, and perhaps even that genes practice something that resembles learning as well. But we are getting even a little bit far out for the total learning framework. And now, and this is my favorite part of this section, we're finally going to get into some really objectionable territory. Does smartphone learn? You lie down on your smartphone bed, it has a certain form, you get off, you lie down at the same spot, you keep lying down the same spot, it takes a new form. It seems to remember what was on it before. Does the ground learn of the impact of an asteroid? It sure seems like it's expressing itself differently after this external stimulus. Is all lasting physical change a form of learning? I'm going to have to say no. That smartphone does not learn. There's no synthesis. There's no imposed pattern. There's no representation. There's only the physical on the physical, not the physical on a representation of the physical, which then gets re-expressed through a new action. And by walking down this path and trying to establish the broadest possible circle of learning, encapsulation of learning, and by trying to put a definition onto what that broadest possible thing is, again, the older definition being a change in long-term memory, we now arrive at something like the collapse of random stimuli into systematic structures. The movement of the blooming, buzzing confusion, as James put it, into some kind of system which takes it, analyzes and manipulates it and represents it, and then perhaps does something in response to that analysis and representation. Maybe this is our new definition. This is not a very strict definition that I presented here. Again, if someone can find a counterexample, which seems like it's definite, could be possibly could be considered to be learning, but doesn't fit this definition, let's hear it and let's include it. But this seems to be something like what we're arriving at, and again, in future discussions, I'll probably get more into what the specific definition of learning should be in this framework to set the bounds of this framework. And I'll wrap up here. This is a little bit more of an obvious question with an obvious answer. Does learning have to be human? Clearly not. Just putting this here because for the rest of this discussion, I'm going to be talking about human learning as I am a psychologist. Everything I'm going to discuss is going to be within the framework of the kind of learning that humans do, um, and the concerns of human learning. But the same concept can be brought to animals and computers and communities and even plants and even ecological systems, as I've been discussing kind of throughout this preamble, bringing up examples of. But for the remainder of this discussion, I'll be focusing on human learning specifically because I'm a psychologist and that's my discipline. But I do believe that the same approach of trying to think about the total learning done with by the subject in a given period of time could be taken into other domains as well. Okay. All right. Implications. We've set the table as best as I could in this time frame. And now we talk about, well, okay, we've set this very wide boundary of learning and what we consider to be learning and what we might accept to be an example of learning. What are the implications of setting that wide definition, that wide boundary, broad definition? Well, the first implication, I think it jumps right out at you, is that current research has been very narrow. Current research by educational psychologists, cognitive psychologists, and anyone concerned with the learning sciences has really been about a narrow definition of what constitutes learning, even as much as it has been broadened over the years, as we discussed before. Wherever you draw the line of what counts as learning, again, you don't have to go all the way out to smartphone in the drawing of what you accept to be total learning. You can draw that line a little bit more closer to home. But wherever you draw that line, you see that there are plenty of practical examples of understudied and perhaps unstudied cases that we have really only studied a fraction of what human beings learn in any kind of detail. Again, more examples in the uses section when we talk about hypotheses that we could generate. But what we're doing right now is we went all the way out. Now let's come back in and show some real demonstrable examples of types of learning that would fit into the total learning construct that are understudied, that haven't had as much attention being paid to them. What about what students learn in classrooms besides what they're being taught? Very often, studies of learning, supposed studies of learning, I say supposed, real studies of learning, but studies of learning, will see children be or students be in a algebra class, and then at the end of that class they'll test them on how much algebra they learned. Makes a lot of sense. Many studies have this basic framework. But what did they learn in that algebra class aside from algebra? Certainly, they must have learned some things. They must have learned the name of their teacher, names of their fellow students, personality traits of their fellow students, what makes the teacher angry, what makes them happy, how to use the computer they've been placed in front of, cheating strategies. What have they learned besides what they're quote unquote being taught? This is an interesting question, which you can see how the total learning framework leads you to ask that kind of question. Yes, we can measure what they're supposed to be learning, but what else are they learning? What else are these subjects learning within this time frame? How about tactile sensations and information? So much of the study of learning has been through vision and sound. There are some studies going on that have involved sense of smell. You do have this line of research of haptic feedback, but we know so much less about the learning that people do through their sense of touch, which certainly should count within the total learning framework. but which is understudied. And what about social information? Again, this is beginning to be studied more frequently in social and emotional learning contexts and with that framework. But other people's names, personalities, lifestyles, this could get into what students are learning in classrooms besides what they're being taught. All of these kinds of learning would be within the total learning framework, but have been understudied to this point. Again, much research, as I've discussed, has considered academic learning, quote unquote academic learning, or quote unquote what we want them to learn. And certainly, I'm not the first person to point out this limitation. It's been pointed out elsewhere by people coming from different theoretical frameworks. The total learning framework asks this question as well, makes this point as well. And you can think about this like total learning as a kind of unlocking effect for researchers. Once you say, look, I'll accept anything as learning, you suddenly see a study everywhere you look. Almost anything could be the object of study. You go walk down the street, you see people chatting in a cafe. What are they learning there? You go to a construction site, you see people putting steel beams into the frame. What are they learning there? You see someone sleeping on the train. What are they learning? What are they learning? All of a sudden, anything can be an object of study. And this could be a drawback. We've set the frame so wide that we now don't even know what questions we could ask, but we can always come back in and say, okay, little bit too crazy to ask this question. Let me ask a question that's a little closer to home, but that's still a step beyond what has been done before. We can always come back in if we feel like we were getting too lost at sea in where we might study learning, what kind of learning we might study. Okay, that's the first main implication. Current research has been very narrow. The second main implication is that people do an immeasurable amount of learning. Not only does a lot of learning occur that is very difficult for us to measure, but they're also doing like way more learning than we might initially feel that they are doing. We've been making this point with previous examples, but let's make it more firmly here. Anytime we test learning, whatever metric measurement that we use, we miss out on almost everything that's going on. We're always underestimating how much people are learning, doing, thinking, etc. When we finish that algebra class and we give that algebra test and we say to the students, show us how much algebra you learned, we're missing out on a lot of what they learned in that time period. We might be capturing some significant portion of what they learned about algebra in that time period, but we're not seeing everything that they learned in that time period. We're not even getting close. Whatever test we give, we see only a tiny fraction of the amount of learning people have done. Even if we say we're going to limit our understanding of how much learning these people are doing to the time they spent with us, just the hour, 2 hours that the algebra class was going on. Even if we limit it just to the content we're interested in, we just want to know how much you learned about algebra, we still are capturing only a fraction of what has occurred. This gets into a point that I'll make more strongly again in the follow-up, but we often assume that the test that we give students of their learning of academic material gives us a representative sample of that student's learning, but that assumption might not be fair. Perhaps I give someone that algebra test and they get 70 out of the 100 questions right, and I say, look, you are a C student. You learned a C's worth of the amount of algebra content I presented. But what if I just happened to ask the questions that the student does not know the answer to, did not learn the answer to, so to speak? What if really their issue is that they have a trouble understanding the phrasing of these English sentences. The algebra concepts they actually did learn. But my test does not give me a representative sample. It has a sampling bias. Again, these issues have been raised elsewhere as well. And indeed, those conversations are informing the total learning conversation that we're having right now. I don't get these ideas from nowhere. But I'll discuss that issue more later. Long story short, whenever we give a test of learning, we're only capturing a tiny, tiny fraction of the total learning that people are doing. People are learning everywhere, at all times, while they do everything, at their job, when they're talking to their friends, when they're playing games, when they're sleeping. And so much of this, again, as we said before, has had limited study. We can't look at someone and say, you haven't hardly learned anything today. What have you been learning all this time? You haven't been learning anything. That's silly. People are always learning all kinds of things. It's just a question of whether or not we're testing them on what they've been learning. This principle that there's like a lot of learning that happens that we take for granted was discovered by machine learning as it emerged and continues to emerge, really struggling to handle just the everyday world. Uh, there was a time when people thought it would be very easy for a computer to understand what a key was and to recognize a key, only to discover that it actually takes a lot of computing power for a computer to understand what a key is and to recognize a key, and then for more computing power to explain what it does and put it into the key lock and so on like that. These are things that we take for granted as people, learning that we take for granted as people. But that is actually extraordinarily nuanced and complicated. Of course, now the computers are getting a lot better at that stuff, but it's very hard for them. It's very hard for them, nonetheless. And as I mentioned briefly before, and again we'll probably expand on in the future, our ability to test learning, to create an approximation of total learning, is limited by both total and type. There's both a bunch of learning going on, we can't get to all of it, but also some aspects of learning are difficult to measure at all. All those internal changes that don't necessarily express themselves in behavior doesn't mean they aren't occurring. Doesn't mean we should dismiss them as not being legitimate. Just means they're hard to test. That's our fault as researchers for not being able to capture. Okay, now this is the next main implication. And this one, I think, is one of the more insightful, so to speak, or original implications of the total learning format. Again, the previous two, these similar points have been made elsewhere. But I maintain that one implication of total learning and the total learning construct is that people learn approximately the same amount in any given period of time. It's not that you are a good student, so to speak, you're a smarty student, you're a smart cookie, you learned more, and this other student, they're not such a good student, they're dumber, they learned less. I think that conception of learning more and learning less is generally untrue, and really people learn about the same amount in any given period of time. There aren't the smart kid who learns more and the dumb kid who learns less. There's just two kids learning different things. And we are measuring more of what the quote-unquote smart kid is learning. If people learn during nearly all activities, sleeping, talking to their friends, going to da-da-da, then everyone should be learning nearly the same total amount in a given amount of time. There's only 24 hours in the day. Okay, you skipped school. You didn't learn very much about algebra today. You didn't learn very much about medieval history today. You didn't learn a whole lot about biology today, but you went to the fairgrounds and you learned about the different machines that they have available and the different games they have available and the skills you need to win those games. You talked to your friends and learned about how their lives are going, their concerns, their plans. you learned a different kind of information, probably a very similar amount of information than the kid who went to school and learned about algebra. There's only 24 hours in a day. You probably learned a very similar amount to that kid who went to school and learned algebra. You just learned something different. Now, this may not be true, this sort of leveling out of total amount of learning. It may not be true in extreme cases of intellectual developmental disability or brain damage. There may be exceptions to this principle, this implication. Famously, the patient HM could not form new explicit memories, although he could form implicit memories. This is a famous case. In those kinds of situations, we could argue that the person is truly learning less than another person in the same period of time. But this principle that people learn approximately the same amount in a given period of time should hold in most cases. And even in the cases of intellectual developmental disability, brain damage, it's still nuanced. We could bring up the example of hyperfixations, where a person with autism learns a lot about a very specific subject to the expense of everything else they might be learning. Did they really learn less, or did they just learn a lot about one thing? It's kind of hard to say. There's some nuance to it, but you could make the argument there is overall less learning occurring because of those issues in the brain. And while this principle that people learn approximately the same amount in a given period of time has a core technical truth, yes, if we say that everything is learning and leads to learning, then everyone learns all the time and everyone learns the same amount. But that's on a technical level. However, I believe that this is probably also practically true as well. That it's not just that, yes, technically people do the same amount of learning, that people really do a similar amount of recognizable learning, of impactful learning, when you take the whole into the account. And you can see this in the classic leveling out of developmental delays and head starts. There's a well-known trend in developmental psychology where a kid who has really great motor control is ahead of their class in motor control. Well, slowly they'll start to level out, and everyone else will catch up to them, and they'll end up out in the middle of the pack in terms of their motor control. And the kid who has really great verbal skills, they're ahead of their cohort in terms of their ability to talk. Well, over time the cohort will kind of catch up, and they'll have about the same as the cohort. And the kid who's behind will kind of catch up, and it's not true for every kid, but it happens a lot of the time that there's this leveling out. Delays catch up, and head starts slow down. And what may be going on here, and you'd have to run some complicated studies to show this, is that the kid who's ahead in terms of their verbal skills is behind somewhere else that we're not measuring. And they devote a little bit less time to their verbal skills and a little bit more time to the things that they're behind until it levels out and they're on the same level with other people. And same to the kid who's behind. They're behind here, but they're a little ahead over somewhere else that we're not measuring, and they spend a little less time on that, a little more time on the thing they're behind on, and they come up to the middle, and that thing drops down to the middle, and everybody winds up being kind of the same. And maybe we have a kid who's behind in verbal skills and who stays behind in verbal skills, but that's because they're up somewhere else, and they're staying up over there, and we're just not measuring necessarily the thing that they're staying up on. Classic leveling out of developmental delays and head starts might be explained through this kind of mechanism of total learning, only so many hours in a day. If someone learns less of what we're measuring, they probably learned more of something else. If they learn more of what we're measuring, they probably learn less of something else. You can give this kind of classic example of, you've got a kid who's a real math whiz, and in math class he's devoting all of his time and his extracurricular time, and he just really loves math. He pours all of his time into math. He learns way more about math than even what's being taught in the class. And he does not do so well in his literature class because he doesn't put time into that class. Whereas there's another kid who puts a middling amount of time into the math class and gets a B, and puts a middling amount of time into the literature class and gets a B. They're learning more about literature than the other student. There's this kind of leveling out in the total learning sense, even though they're learning less about math. And of course, there are kids who get A's in all the subjects, but what are they missing out on? Maybe they have less free time to spend talking to their peers and learning about their peers, less free time to spend watching movies and learning about popular culture. It's only 24 hours in a day. This brings up a kind of secondary implication, this idea of the jack of all trades versus the master of one. Because of the limitations of testing and its ability to show total learning, the total learning that's being done, we might tend to underestimate the jack of all trades and overestimate the learning done by the master of one. Because to test the amount of learning done by the master of one, we just need to test them on the thing that they're master of. But to test the learning of the jack of all trades, we'd have to test all the things they've been investing their time into, and to show that they've learned a similar amount, we'd have to test everything both of them have learned about and see the very slightly worse performance on the master everywhere else, and the very slightly better performance of the gesture everywhere else except for the thing which the master is the master of. That's very difficult to do. It's much easier to test the master on what the master is the master of, and the jack of all trades on what the master is a master of, and see that the master is clearly outperforming the jack of all trades. This study where we test them on everything and show that, hey, the jack of all trades is learning a little bit more everywhere else except in this one pole, and that little bit more is adding up to be pretty similar height to that one pole, seems impractical to do. But it could be possible we found an antipode where a master of a certain thing tends to learn very, very little about another thing, or a set of other things. And you can give an example of a chess grandmaster. A lot of expertise studies have been done, or a lot of the original expertise studies were done with chess grandmasters. You know, a lot of chess grandmasters, they start when they're very young, when they're, 9, 10, 11, they start to seriously play chess, and it starts to take up a lot of their day. They play chess during the day, they play chess when they get home, they read chess books, they look at chess positions, they analyze on their chess computer. Famously, there's a grandmaster named Fabiano Caruana. He dropped out of high school to pursue chess and do chess all day, every day. There's only 24 hours. What movies is that grandmaster not watching? What conversations is that grandmaster not having? Has that grandmaster missed out on? What books did they not read? What class did they not pay attention to because they were all eyes on chess? And if you add it up, and there's probably no practical way to do this, but if you added up all of the learning that they missed out on by prioritizing learning about chess, wouldn't it all add up to be a similar amount of total learning? People learn approximately the same amount in a given period of time. This has a further implication that students who are struggling in school, who are seemingly not learning a lot of what's being taught in the classroom, may be learning how to handle their home situation. They may be learning skills they need to do their part-time job. They may be meditating on their personal philosophy. And this may be more useful to them than the learning they're supposed to be doing in school. We shouldn't look at the student who's not performing well in school and saying, why aren't you learning anything? We should say, what are you learning instead of what we think you should be learning, which you're supposed to be learning in class? More on this in the implications coming up. Okay, and we'll close this section here by saying that this position that people tend to learn a similar amount in a given period of time is might strike one as a relativistic stance. Oh, well, we all learn about the same amount. There's no way to say that anybody is learning more or less than anybody else, so we're all about equal. Relativistic. However, it is not necessarily a relativistic stance. It can be taken that way, you can interpret it that way, but you don't have to. You can make a statement that not all learning is necessarily of equal value. You can make a normative statement. And two people may do an extremely different amounts of useful learning in the same time period. The one student spends a lot of time learning about algebra, while the other student spends a lot of time learning about pop culture. Maybe we want to argue that that student's time is better spent, but which students do we want to argue is spending their time better? That's a normative statement. It's a value statement, but it is a conversation we can have. It's not necessarily a relativistic stance. But we replace a conversation of about you learned more than this other person to you learned more useful things than this other person did. It's a new framework on that conversation. With this in mind, you can propose ways of dividing total learning. If we take total learning to be the circle, the sphere that encompasses all the learning done by a person, we can cut that shape up into different sections, into different categories, into different types of learning, different subcategories to describe important differences in learning outcomes. We don't have to leave that idea of that educational psychology idea of learning, of you got the right answers to the important questions. We don't have to leave that on the wayside. We can simply take that understanding and put it into the total learning framework by creating subcategories. And what I'll present to you here are two ways of divvying up learning that I found to be interesting and useful, but there are other ways as well. The first type of divvying up of the total learning cake into slices, so to speak, that I'll present is three types of learning, divvying up into three pieces: useful learning, not useful learning, and counterproductive learning. Okay, what is useful? What is useful learning? Well, useful learning would be what a lot of educational psychologists would consider to be real learning, either implicitly or explicitly in the way that they ask questions and find evidence. This is learning changes in long-term memory, so to speak, which is accurate. It matches empirical reality. It improves our understanding of the world, of ourselves. It encourages metacognitive development. You can see how these things might be useful. This type of learning is active and will last and lead to future action. And it predicts income, status, social status, career status, mental health, etc. Predicts positive outcomes. That when you learn more of these things, you get better outcomes in these other metrics. Note, of course, that this is value-based. Should income really be a metric of whether or not this is something useful to learn? That's an ongoing question. But whatever we decide is a valuable outcome, we can then say this type of learning leads to that valuable outcome, therefore it is useful learning. Again, this is often what educational psychology is implicitly looking for when it studies learning, is how much useful learning are you doing? How much of this type of learning are you doing? Okay, and then not useful, of course, follows from useful. And not useful learning would be the wrong answers on that algebra quiz, the 30% incorrect answers, so to speak. Not useful learning would be about irrelevant, superfluous, or meaningless information. A waste of time, we might call it. Ebbinghaus is learning of random number sequences and syllable sequences. why are we spending our time learning this? It's This kind of learning is often passive and quickly forgotten. It will not lead to future action or change, unlike useful learning. Maybe we got it in there, but what am I going to do with it? There's a concept of diminishing returns with not useful learning. Chess might give you certain metacognitive benefits up to a certain point, but once you get to a very high rating, you're 2000, rated 2,200, does it really matter that you learn a little bit more about chess and now you're 2,300? Was that really useful to you? Is that going to lead to any kind of positive demonstrable outcome? Or have you already gotten everything you could get out of learning this skill set? You're not a grandmaster yet. You're not going to be a grandmaster. Why are you doing this? Okay. Diminishing returns is another principle, what might make you learning not useful. And perhaps the things you're learning do not predict better income, status, mental health, etc. They don't seem to lead to these things that we consider to be valued outcomes. I would argue that this category of learning, the learning of not useful information, is broadly understudied, again relating to an implication we discussed before. And it might be useful to study this category of learning. Again, we'll talk about this in the use cases. In order to understand the appeal, why do people choose to go out of their way to learn, say, a bunch of factoids about geography that they don't seem to have any use for? They just want to go learn it. What's the appeal of that kind of learning? Can we get that appeal to transfer over into learning that we consider to be useful? Okay. And there's a final category in this kind of framework which we would call counterproductive learning. And this is learning, these are changes in long-term memory, or even in a broader definition, systematic structural application onto random stimuli, which can be counterproductive. You can define two kinds of counterproductive learning, which are sort of collectively defined as being worse than useless. There's incorrect learning and immoral learning. One is wrong about empirical reality. I got the wrong phone number. This is counterproductive because I end up calling the wrong person. I need to unlearn that and learn the real phone number. And the other is wrong about social, cultural, or ethical reality. You can correctly learn how to commit crimes. You can correctly learn how to make meth out of assorted convenience store products. But we might consider that kind of learning, though it is accurate to empirical reality, to be counterproductive. Counterproductive learning, unlike useless or not useful learning, is often active and it will often last and lead to future action. That's the problem. And it's often distorted, misremembered. There's a misinterpretation. And of course, we should note that what we see as misinterpretation and distortion to the person is just interpretation. Again, more on that later. And counterproductive learning predicts harmful behaviors, inefficient solutions, misconceptions, negative outcomes like poverty, violence, poor mental health, etc. That's how we might define counterproductive learning. And there's an implication here for how learning should be tested. There's a difference between someone who leaves a question blank and someone who answers it wrong. Even though in many classrooms, they would be scored the same. You get -1 point either way. Even though the latter situation is worse. And there's a line of research about misconceptions, which certainly fits in with this point. That's one way to divide learning. This division of total learning into these categories of useful, not useful, and counterproductive learning, I've drawn because it sort of follows along lines that are often implicitly drawn at the present in the way that especially educational psychologists set up their studies, where useful learning is considered to be the real form of learning, and not useful and counterproductive learning are either not covered or seen of as the wrong answers to the test, and therefore not learning. Educational psychology often prioritizes the study of useful learning and divides on these lines. The history of educational psychology has, in fact, had a quality of elevating learning that was perceived as being not useful to seeing the use of that learning, to being useful. Famously, again within the field, Jean Lave, Barbara Rogoff started these series of studies of intent participation, of apprenticeship, showing that there's real skilled learning going on in places which we may have thought there was not real useful learning going on. The elevation of apparently not useful learning, or what was regarded as being not useful learning, to the status of useful learning. But still with that focus of saying, hey, this is useful learning. We're so focusing on useful learning. We're not studying things and saying, look, this learning is useless. We just want to see how it works. And of course, there's a focus in educational psychology on correcting counterproductive learning, on correcting misconceptions of saying, we want to see more useful learning. How do we get more useful learning and less not useful and counterproductive learning? Another way of divvying up total learning into subcategories, and there are more ways, I'm only going to present two right now that I think are particularly salient, is you can divvy it up into correct, fictitious, and incorrect learning. Again, incorrect being where misconceptions would be placed. And the idea of this way of divvying up learning is to remove the moral or value or performance-based judgment that useful learning carries with it, and instead take an empirical stance and say, is this learning that maps to the observed reality observed by the empirical method? Of course, questions about the validity of empirical reality notwithstanding, that's getting a little too philosophical. But the goal here is to strip that normative, value-based element which useful learning carries, to have a useful way of divvying up total learning, which nonetheless says something about the type of learning that's being done. Correct learning is when what the person learns is validated by empirical reality or rational law. This can be correct scientifically. The sun is mostly made of hydrogen would be a correct thing to learn, empirically validated. It could be mathematic, A plus B equals B plus A. That would be rational law. That's correct. Of course, you can debate that, but let's accept that as being correct. Or it could be everyday learning, which is validated by that everyday empiricism, which we practice as we walk around the world. My door is made of wood. Of course, there's plenty of gray area as to what qualifies as correct learning. Of course, there's famously a division between Newton's conception of gravity and Einstein's conception of gravity, and depending on which science class you're in, you might hear either one of those conceptions presented as being correct. You may even hear that both of them are correct, even though they are mutually exclusive, and Einstein seems to be more accurate when you take them to extreme cases. If we are going to debate if the learning is correct or incorrect, importantly, we're having a debate about ontology and epistemology, which is how we know that we're defining things in terms of correctness and incorrectness. Okay, now this middle category here is a little contentious. You don't necessarily have to accept it as a category. You could simply divide between correct and incorrect, but I find it useful in terms of thinking about how you might study learning. You can also talk about fictitious, learning of things that are fictitious. You learn about things that are fictitious, where what the person learns is not real, but they are aware that what they're learning is not empirically real. The moon is made of cheese is a fact, quote unquote fact, that I can repeat, that I know, that I've learned, But I know that the moon is not actually made of cheese, and what I've really learned is a kind of cultural artifact that people at one point thought that the moon was made of cheese. That's what I've really learned. And that has its own kind of empirical reality, but it's not the empirical reality of the statement. It's a social reality, or the artifact of a social reality. I've learned about something that is fictitious. Hallucinations, I can remember that I've hallucinated something. That's a kind of learning. That's a memory of experience that I've had. I know that it was not really present in empirical reality except insofar as my neurons fired, and that was the empirical reality of that hallucination. Plenty of gray area. You can combine this with correct and incorrect, but I think it can be useful to separate as we treat this knowledge differently. We debate culture in a way that we, in a different way that we debate scientific fact. That debate is about ontology and epistemology, whereas the debate about culture is a debate of what knowledge is socially constructed. Of course, all these things do overlap with each other. And finally, the last category in this division is incorrect. What the person learns is not real. But they are not aware of this. And in my opinion, this is an important distinction between what we might call the learning of things that are fictitious and the learning of things that are incorrect. What the person learns is not real, it's not validated by empirical reality, but they're not aware of this. The person really believes that the world is flat. They have misconceptions and they have delusions. Delusions being differentiated from hallucinations. The memory of a delusion being a different kind of learning than the memory of a hallucination because the person is not aware that what they hallucinated was not empirically real. Plenty of gray area here as well. Of course, existentialism, that grand branch of philosophical history, has a lot to say about what we really can say is true and not true, correct and incorrect. But certainly we can draw these lines if we like. Okay. Notably, these categories can apply to non-neural learning. As we've discussed, total learning tries to incorporate things that are learning that do not take place in the brain. For example, we can see allergies as a kind of counterproductive learning that the immune system has taken on, where it has a aggressive response to something that is harmless. It's learned a bad behavior. Very interesting. One of the reasons this is an important thing to highlight, that we can draw these different categories, but they all still are within the framework of total learning as far as cognition is understood, is that there's reason to believe the same cognitive mechanisms underlie all of these different categories of learning. That whether what we're learning is useful or not useful or counterproductive, we're still using the same brain to learn those three different kinds of things. We're still using the same processes. We're still taking in that visual information and it's processing the occipital lobe, and it's going to the streams and to the frontal. Okay. It's the same process underlie these. The brain doesn't know ahead of time if what it's learning is quote unquote right or wrong. It just learns things. This is why perhaps the total learning framework saying, look, here's all the learning that's being done, and we're going to separate into categories after the fact, may be more accurate and maybe more of a useful interpretive lens than saying, look, you only have learned if what you've learned is validated by empirical reality, otherwise you have a misconception. Because really the person who has the misconception does not know what they have as a misconception. To them it's a conception. And total learning makes that point a little bit clearer. Again, more on that later. While the cognitive mechanisms in the brain may be the same, whether the learning is right or wrong, teaching styles may be different. There may be practical differences in teaching styles between teaching information that is empirically validated and teaching information that is not empirically validated. This again, we talked about when we talk about hypotheses. Again, these are only two possible ways. I think these are salient, they're relevant ways, but you can divide up that total learning circle, that total learning sphere, all the learning that a person has done into all different kinds of subcategories. And indeed, total learning can fit almost any other perspective within it. And the question will just be, what is the use of that perspective, and what is it leaving in and what is it leaving out of that from that total learning framework? We can give the example that would take from the perspective of situated learning, where a person learns something but appears to only learn it in a specific context and does not generalize necessarily to other contexts. Well, from the total learning perspective, we can say, you learned how to do this in this context. Now, if you extend that principle into other contexts, you've just expanded your total learning as you've done so. But indeed, so that's a situated learning example. But again, cognitive load theory can fit within the framework of total learning, and in fact has its own kind of total learning framework. Social and emotional learning fits within the total learning framework. Can be thought of as a subcategory within that greater bubble. What is it next to? What does it connect to within the total learning framework? Again, it's a kind of totalizing narrative. It has this structure, this concept. This is also potentially a downside to it, where it's too broad and you start to lose track of things, but you can always come back in. Okay, what the next implication here, I'm going to go through a little more quickly because it's a little bit of a tangent. It's a related tangent. I think it follows naturally from some of the other implications that I've been discussing. But it is a bit of a tangent. It's sort of its own topic. And once again, it's something that I've been thinking about, that's been framing the way that I've been considering things that I see as being compatible with the total learning construct, and which incorporates points that have been made elsewhere. But this is this idea of reframing the term education. I'm an educational psychologist, but in the total learning framework, it's clear that education and learning are not synonymous. That education is a subset of learning. The total learning that a person is doing is not the same as the learning that they're doing as within the framework of education. They're doing a lot of learning that is not, quote unquote, their education. It's a small but perhaps important subset of learning, and this is clear within the total learning framework. But again, other people have made this point as well without adopting that framework. What is education? Again, this is a whole, I'll probably do another video on this subject, but education I would define as learning that is culturally or socially valued, quote unquote useful within the total learning framework, and is intentionally transmitted. Learning that is not culturally valued is not education, and learning that is culturally valued but is picked up, quote unquote, by osmosis, just as you go along, is also not education. When such information, such skills are intentionally transmitted, they become education. When something socially valued that is usually not intentionally transmitted is intentionally transmitted, it becomes education. To give an example, let's take something like how to tie knots, how to tie different types of knots. Back in the 1800s, 1700s, this would have been something that would have been much more culturally valued than it is now, because tying knots is a very important skill you could have as a shipwright and is doing all different kinds of jobs. As technology has changed, the ability to tie different types of knots has fallen in its relevance, in its quote-unquote usefulness, and therefore it's not as culturally valued. It still is culturally valued to some extent, maybe in some senses because of that legacy of when it was useful. but it's not as culturally valued and therefore is not taught in formal educational settings as often. It's not thought of as being education. It's something you can go learn how to do, but you do so on your own time. Something like giving a firm handshake is considered to be socially valued in the West, where I live. But it's something you're expected to learn on your own. You wouldn't necessarily learn it in school. It's not education. It wouldn't be thought of as education. You're supposed to just learn it as you go. However, if you take an etiquette class, you may in fact learn how to shake someone's hand, give them a firm handshake very specifically in a very precise way. And now it's a class. It's education. It's intentionally transmitted and socially valued. That's what gets something tagged as education. Education, the type of learning that qualifies as education, is taught by quote unquote educators, teachers, masters, parents, tutors. For educational institutions, schools, training departments, internship sites, in educational spaces. Again, schools, the school building itself, training facilities, and within learning management systems in the online space. There are, of course, gray areas, especially in master-apprentice relations, as has been described by Jean Lave, and that whole line of research where learning is going on, but production is going on at the same time. And the space is an educational space, yes, but it's also a space of real production. Okay, gray areas. Learning that is not education, that does not get that tag of education, is taught by whoever for no specific reason, just about anywhere else. It could be in the hallways of the school rather than the classrooms. And I would argue that clearly more learning that people do happens this way than happens in the educational spaces. You spend more time outside of school, between classes, talking to friends, than you do in school. And you're learning the whole time. What qualifies as education, quote unquote, depends on the social and material reality of a group. Learning classical music is education, learning death metal is not, unless the cultural opinions, the values change. If death metal gets elevated culturally, now maybe you can be educated in it. Shipwriting is education until industrialization, then no need, now it's a hobby. It's associated, what is considered to be education, what counts as education, is associated with class, political and economic power, discrimination, what kinds of learning are viewed as being legitimate. Again, these issues have been discussed at length elsewhere and probably deserve their whole own discussion. It changes over time, especially with changes in technology. Often lags, holds on to tradition. Again, that shipwriting example. It's a good example. In the West, education is associated with a specific approach to instruction. There's a teacher, a class of students, and tests. In fact, that system of instruction is part of how a learning practice is culturally legitimized and turned into education, considered to be education. If you can look like education, you can be education. If you can open a beauty school where there's a beauty teacher who teaches a class of beauty students and gives them beauty tests, now maybe you can be a real educational institution. It's not the only model, the one that is common in the West, the so-called industrialized model or banking model, as Paulo Freire referred to it as. And the history of this is a whole subject which I'll probably discuss elsewhere. This is an interesting point. When learning is researched by professional learning scholars, it often becomes educationized. Jean Piaget's findings become inquiry learning. Social and emotional development becomes social and emotional learning and can be taught in social and emotional learning sessions in classes by social and emotional learning teachers. It can be tested. Play-based learning becomes play-based learning interventions, the effects of which can be tested and are delivered by a teacher. There's a big jump from, hey, this thing is good and helps lead to development, to we should teach it in formal classes and optimize its transmission, but that jump is often made reflexively. Jean Piaget famously was not really a huge fan of interventions based on his work. He said, I'm just describing how people develop. Why are you trying to optimize it? All of this leads to a reframing of schools as well. In its idealized state, a school is an institution which facilitates education, whatever we consider education to be. In practice, schools are messier. There's a lot of competing interests. There's the need to look good on paper rather than maybe really leading to true education and true learning. There's the need to free up the labor force so the parents can go work. So let's put all these kids into a classroom. And of course, there's the desire to create striation. Again, this is the industrialized, this is the banking model of education. Say you're better than a better student than you are. Okay, that is a little bit of a tangent, which I'll probably do a full discussion of later, but I think it follows very naturally because total learning really makes this the narrowness of the learning that is done in school stark. The learning that is considered to be education stark. It says this is only a fraction of the total learning that is conducted by people, by students in their day-to-day lives. It has overlap with that the total, the whole child perspective, that students exist outside of school and learn things outside of school. Okay, those I think are like the key implications of the total learning framework. Again, there's more that will get they'll get their time in the sun. Let's talk now about the uses. Okay, we've outlined this framework, this construct, the total learning construct. We've talked about some of the implications of that framework, of that construct. What is the point of going through all this trouble? Well, the total learning construct carries with it a lot of the advantages that other constructs carry with them, other theoretical frameworks carry with them, one of which is to generate new hypotheses. Novel perspectives can generate novel questions and predictions. While total learning can't be measured directly, it can inspire predictions that can be. It can inspire falsifiable claims. A few examples that have come to me, I can list out some of them right now. They're not quite formal hypotheses because still developing them, but they're getting kind of close. And of course, some of them may have been done before, and I'm just not aware of it, but certainly they haven't been done en masse. One hypothesis you can kind of lean yourself towards, you'd have to state it more formally than this, but you might say something like students who spend less time learning academic material in class will spend more time learning about their peers. This is getting into that implication of people learn approximately the same amount. Wouldn't this be an interesting research question to pose? Experts will be able to describe common activities that they missed out on while studying their main subject. Getting to that chess grandmaster example, oh yeah, I never saw that movie, I don't know a lot about this, I didn't have a lot of these kinds of conversations, I didn't do that many sports when I was in school because I was busy doing chess all the time. That's a prediction we might make. We have to find a way to measure it. People will direct their own learning outside of classrooms more frequently than in them. In the classroom, there's a teacher who's directing learning. Outside the classroom, learning is still occurring, but the individual must direct it themselves. No one is telling them what to do. These are all ideas that I've had coming from the total learning framework. People perform more rigorous literary analysis on media they consume in their free time than they do in their English classes. Now, this is a really interesting claim that I think passes the gut check. Like, if you think about people you've known, this may very well apply to them. Fits into that total learning framework. What literary analysis are people doing outside of their English class that we're not maybe not measuring? The same issues encountered in changing people's misconceptions. There's a whole line of research of how it's very difficult to get people to change their misconceptions. Will be encountered if one attempts to change their correct conceptions. Because misconceptions are just conceptions to the person who holds them. People employ regulation strategies, self-regulation strategies to avoid remembering things that they don't want to know. This is a really interesting claim, I believe. Comes from the total learning perspective, allows you to ask an interesting and original question, make an interesting prediction. And again, this is just a quick list. You could easily come up with more. And I think all these are examples of predictions that are interesting, that haven't been, researched and researched before, that would give valuable insights into learning and learning processes, that are a little bit in left field, out in left field, that you can see the ties between them and the total learning implications and framework. Total learning might also help to find new explanations and misconnections, might contribute to learning theory. Broad perspectives can identify connections between previously segregated theoretical perspectives, put old theories in a new light, lead to new ideas. I discussed before how all the different frameworks about learning and what constitutes learning and how learning functions could fit within total learning, the total learning framework. I've personally been considering the overlap between the self-regulated learning framework, which is a way of thinking about metacognition and learning behaviors, and situated learning, which is a different line of research. Do people practice self-regulated learning in non-academic contexts? How do self-regulated learning strategies relate to legitimate peripheral participation? These are the kinds of things which, when you adopt a broad framework of learning, you can start to put these Lego pieces together. Try to, anyway. We can give the example of cognitive load theory reframed within the total learning framework. It fits into the total learning framework in the sense that it says that you must sacrifice some forms of learning for others, extraneous versus intrinsic load. But maybe human memory is more broadly capable than the cognitive load theory would imply, based on its focus on working memory and active attention to what is to be learned. Implicit learning is included within the total learning framework. Maybe cognitive load theory covers one admittedly important learning process, but only one, which can then be related to other learning processes within the total learning framework. Unexpected limitations or results from studies can be interpreted as unanticipated learning, rather than saying, oh, you guys, we gave you these algebra problem worksheet. We thought you learned more about algebra. You appear not to be learning anything more about algebra. Why is that the case? Well, maybe they're learning how to game these worksheets. They're doing a different kind of learning, a kind of problem-solving learning that you didn't anticipate. But that doesn't mean they're not learning. So reframes unexpected results of studies. Another use of the total learning framework, maybe it will help us appreciate unacknowledged efforts and progress. I think that this has been kind of implicit in a lot of the statements I've been making to this point, that whole child perspective. When students underperform academically, rather than assuming deficiency, we might be inclined to ask, what are they learning instead? of what we expect them to learn academically. Rather than they didn't learn, what they learned instead, rather than you need to study more because you're not learning what you're supposed to. What are you doing instead of studying? Oh, you have a part time job to help your family? But what were you learning there? Were you learning useful things there? Are you really applying yourself there? This new kind of question, this new kind of statement. This is simpatico with the whole child approach and perspective, as I've been mentioning. If we ask the child, what are you doing instead of studying? What are you learning instead of the academic material? And we get an answer like, oh, I have a part-time job. We might be inclined to appreciate that child more. On the other hand, if we ask that question and they say, oh, you play a video game for 6 hours every night and you spend $400 to give your character a funny hat. Well, maybe that kind of learning is not very useful. Yes, you're learning how to play this video game, you're learning the rules of the video game, how to get better at the video game, the skills for the video game, but how are you going to use that in your life? Maybe you should do less of that kind of learning and more of a different kind of learning, which we will now propose to you. But it's a different kind of question. Again, not necessarily a relativistic stance, but asking a different kind of question. Understand study limitations. Researchers often treat correct answers as learning, as we discussed before, but this is probably not really fair. We might be able to better anticipate what people might learn before and in our experimental situation that is not intended by us and preempt it or ask about it when we take a total learning perspective. Rather than saying, oh, we're going to present this information and we intend for them to learn this information and they're going to learn or not learn that information, we can say, oh, we're going to present this information that we intend for them to learn, but probably they're going to learn a bunch of things that we don't intend for them to learn. What are those things and how can we incorporate them into our study? The total learning perspective puts a damper on claims about nearing a totalized understanding of human learning and cognition. Again, Skinner thought that he was close to a total understanding back in 1950 with the unconditioned and conditioned response. It's been proven too limited many times before. There's probably something we're not measuring, that we're not considering when we try to create our understanding of human learning processes. Total learning has implications for education and pedagogy. By learning about how and what people learn outside of the classroom, we can learn more about how and what to teach in the classroom. More on this in follow-up. To connect classroom learning to students' prior knowledge, we might want to learn more about what knowledge students gain outside of the classroom. That's within the total learning framework. We might want to see how and what people learn in unstructured environments to inform what we should bring into structured ones. How and what people choose to learn when they're free to choose. And this is an interesting implication of total learning, but if we care about the amount of useful learning that people are doing, instead of forcing students to learn what we are intending and what we are measuring, we might encourage them to do more useful learning in general, rather than trying to force this kid who does not want to learn algebra to sit in that algebra class and learn algebra because that is what we are measuring whether or not you're learning. Well, what if we can convince them to learn something else that is useful in that same given period of time? Isn't he doing just as much useful learning as a kid who is sitting down to learn algebra? Isn't that still a productive thing? Okay. Reaching the end here. Again, I plan to do a follow-up video, probably not as my immediate follow-up, but in the future, about further implications of the total learning framework, total learning construct, plans and expectations for myself in terms of the adoption and implementation of this framework. I don't know if hopefully it came across in the video that I'm very excited about total learning and this way of thinking about learning and education. Um, and I'm hoping that, as time goes on, I'll be able to develop this idea and maybe make it something that is useful to other people as well. And hopefully this video is the first step in that process. Okay, I'm getting tired, and it's time for me to get a drink of water. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.